Welcome to the Tactics Meeting, Episode 12, the Environmental Unit and Alternative Response Strategies, with Dr. Elliott Taylor from Polaris Applied Sciences. Here in the Tactics Meeting, we talk to subject matter experts about response tactics and technology. Our expert is Dr. Elliott Taylor from Polaris Applied Sciences, and he's going to enlighten us on the work that Polaris does in the US and really around the world, and the inner workings of the environmental unit in particular. Elliott, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm looking forward to this.
Well, as I do with everybody who comes on the program, we're going to start off by, how did you get into oil spill response? This is not something that people choose as an elective when they're picking out their minor in college. It's almost everybody that I talk to somehow or another got sucked into Exxon Valdez or similar. So how did it happen for you?
Well, the good news, Dan, is that at least my degree was in oceanography. That's what I studied when I got into college, and I went through, did my PhD. It was always oceanography, and very much oriented on the geological side. So I did everything from deep sea sediments up to coastal environments and coastal processes. But you're right, I wasn't doing spill response back in 1989. I actually was a lecturer over at the Department of Geology at the University of Washington, and I was a visiting scholar doing some research with the university when the Exxon Valdez spill happened. And being aware of what was going on, it being in Seattle, we had actually only recently moved to Seattle. I had only been there for a year. But everything that's happening up in Alaska is drawing, of course, a lot of attention up there. And as I reached out to a company that was set up in Seattle that was doing a lot of work helping with the response. And in particular, they were looking at the shoreline and the SCAT program. Actually, in those days, SCAT was barely out the door. It wasn't even really known that much. And the company in Seattle, big engineering firm, is one that I had done work with in graduate school off and on. I'd been doing environmental sampling programs with them in the Gulf of Mexico and off the North Slope of Alaska. So I was familiar with them, and I visited them one day, and they said, well, any time that you have available, we need people that understand what's happening in the coastal area and coastal processes. Help. So I started doing some pickup work while I was still teaching and finishing my research. I finished the teaching portion at the end of the spring quarter. And then they said, well, all the time that you have available, we want to use you. And so that summer, I launched into being all the data management and support side of the response here in Seattle. So all the SCAT teams were sending their data reports in, sending photos in. This is in the day of actual print photos, with canisters of film, and all this stuff is coming in. And I had a team here that was organizing it, sifting it, and preparing reports off of everything that's being observed up in by the teams, the SCAT teams. And that was it for the next 3 years. That's what I was either here or I was up in Prince William Sound, actually on the beach itself, doing SCAT work. But that was a right-hand turn in my field. I could have gone to continued in academics and research, but no, I went to consulting, and it's been oil spill response ever since.
Yeah, that is such a common story. with with Al Allen and you and Jerry Galt, and you almost need to get the an Exxon Valdez reunion group together.
Yeah, well, we need to hurry it up because some of those folks are going to be hard to find anymore.
Well, hopefully we're capturing some of that information for posterity right now. So how did Polaris Applied Sciences get started? So you were working for somebody else throughout Exxon Valdez.
Right. Yeah. So, well, I continued with that company for a couple of years, and then I went out and did freelanced. I did set up my own shop and was doing some freelance work. I was working on a lot of projects with Ed Owens. He had set up his own shop, and we ended up on a number of spills with Gary Mouseth, who was at the time with Beak, and then he wanted to leave and set up his own shop. And so at one point we decided on one spill, why don't we just form a group ourselves instead of these into our own little shops? And so that's what happened. Ed, myself, and Gary, and Greg Challenger, we came together and set up Polaris, and that was in October of '98. So we've been Polaris Applied Sciences ever since.
Are all the principals still there?
No, Ed is back to his own shop. He's back to Owens Coastal Consultants, but literally downstairs from where I am. So we continue to work jointly on quite a few projects. And then Mouseth is retired. So he's enjoying life up in the San Juan Islands and his grandkids. But yeah, Greg and I are still, two of the principals, and then we have another principal, Andy Graham, with the company at present, and continue doing the same sort of work though.
So there aren't that many oil spills of any significant size anymore. I mean, we had it at Deepwater Horizon, where I spent 105 days in the recovery group. I'm sure you spent much longer than that, since SCAT went on for what, 3 years, 4 years? Could still be going on for all I know. I lost track.
Well, you're right. Being part of the shoreline group, you are there for typically a lot longer than on water operations. And that's the way it is. We were there for 3 years with SCAT. And then there was another year, a little bit more of follow-up monitoring that was done, particularly on some of the marshes. But yeah, we had all of our crew down there, plus we had quite a few subcontractors that we've worked with over the years participating on Deepwater Horizon, spread between the Louisiana-Texas border all the way over to Florida, and into Florida, clearly.
So when you're not actively engaged in oil spill response, what other projects does Polaris engage in? What are your specialties?
We do a lot of planning. So we work with developing plans, spill contingency plans, response plans. A lot of those, of course, in the US, we're kind of past that phase, although recently we've done a lot with the rail industry as regulations came in place for those operations, and likewise in Canada. And we do a lot of training. So we're working with people on preparedness in everything from environmental unit or SCAT training to natural resource damage assessment. A big portion of what Polaris also does is natural resource damage assessments. And we do those not just for spills, but a lot of the work happens to be for groundings. When a ship runs aground, there's damage. There may be damage associated with the grounding just by itself, as well as with removal or the work that happens to salvage the vessel. And we're often called in to help and make recommendations on those and do an assessment of what the grounding impacts are. We couldn't be in Mauritius ourselves because of COVID issues, but one of our subcontractors was in Mauritius and doing the assessment of during the Wakashio grounding and then ensuing removal to clearly identify what the effects of the grounding were, and any effects and minimize and try to mitigate to the extent possible any further impacts from just the salvage operations. So we get involved in those things as well. A lot of coral reef. So some of our team are top class worldwide in coral reef damages and restoration work. So that's a big another portion of what we do. And then I end up actually doing a fair amount of international work around planning. We're just completing the National Oil Spill Contingency Plan for Kenya. We recently helped Mozambique with theirs. We did a plan for Belize just a couple years ago. And it sounds great, but you don't get to spend a whole lot of time just, hanging out on the beach when you're doing things like that. Although the travel is always interesting, and meeting people and working with people in each of these countries is also very rewarding in itself.
I know what you mean. I was down in Brazil when I worked with NJ Resources for a oil spill drill with Shell. We were right across the street from one of the most famous beaches in the world. I was there for 9 days. I walked on it once for 15 minutes. I mean, like everywhere else, you're in a hotel, you're in a windowless banquet room. You could be anywhere. And to that extent, I'm really liking the virtual command post thing, because if I have to be anywhere, I would just as soon be here.
Yeah.
In my office with my 3 monitors and all the things that make me reasonably productive, and I don't have to worry about whether somebody's coffee is going to be any good or not.
No, there's a lot to be said for not having the extensive travel and just hours and sometimes days on aircraft and then even on the ground to get to some of these remote areas. If you're looking at we mapped all the shorelines of Angola, so it's an amazing project, but it takes a lot to get out to some of the remote areas and be able to do that work. We develop GRPs or GRSs for their priority sensitive areas, and the same thing. You can spend days in a Jeep to get out to some of these places, and of course you have to be aware of where the mines have been removed and where mines are still possibly in place. So there's a lot of interesting things around the world that this work has taken us into. That's for sure.
Yeah, well, I was thinking, well, I'd like to go until you said the word mines, and now I don't want to go anymore.
That's right.
So Polaris has been part of the Washington State Maritime Cooperative's spill management team for a very long time. We cite Polaris as being the leaders of the environmental unit for our plan. And we have a drill coming up in May where you personally are going to be the deputy environmental unit leader. So I was hoping we could talk a little bit about the environmental unit and what you think it takes in general, but specifically in Washington, to be successful in the environmental unit, and maybe talk a little about staffing, because so often I think we are understaffed or are slow to staff up.
Mm.
So, maybe share with our audience, what that initial ramp up would look like ideally. And then we're going to be doing dispersants in our drill, and I'd like to talk about what it takes to put together the materials that the region response team needs to have in front of them to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down for dispersant application. So let's start with the environmental unit. What do you think it takes to be successful there?
Right. Well, here in Washington State, as you're aware, one of the first considerations under the Northwest Area Plan is that the EU lead is going to be, one of the state agencies responsible for their environment. So in our case, Department of Ecology, it could be Department of Environmental Quality down in Oregon, but they're going to take the lead. Now, that being said, a co-lead could be somebody who represents the responsible party. So, in my case, I could be a co-lead along with ecology here in the state, or a deputy, depending on the situation. I think one of the important things to recognize is that anybody that's been in an exercise or been in an actual response here in this state knows, recognizes immediately that there's going to be a lot of attention and a lot of expectations out of the environmental unit, the EU. And I think in my experience, particularly over the last decade or more, the RPs, experts and technical specialists that are part of the environmental unit have worked very well hand in hand with the state and with the ecology in particular. So there's a good rapport, and there's a good working environment. And that's one of the benefits of just doing these exercises. We may not get many spills, great. And the exercises really give you that face time and each other. So it becomes a very positive working environment. And it's not atypical that the people that are going to show up early in the response already understand what their roles and responsibilities are in the EU. I think one of the challenges, as with any group, subset group within an incident command post, is doing just what you're saying, and that is recognizing what skill sets you need for this particular situation, for this particular incident, and then staffing up what your level of staffing needs to be, and quickly get that into place. But in the EU, you're going to expect somebody from ecology here in the state, and the RP presumably will show up with their co-lead or a deputy. And then you start staffing up from there, clearly. And one of the first things you're looking for is understanding what the resources at risk are, your RARs, getting that information quickly pulled together to inform unified command and establish what some of the priorities are going to be in terms of protection for operations to implement. Now, our state here in Washington, in the Northwest, has done a remarkable job at putting the GRPs together and identifying potential spill sources, scenarios, and what sort of the likely areas that may be possibly influenced by the spill are going to be, and then have to identify priorities in those areas in terms of protection, initial protection priorities. That's a fantastic piece of work that's been done over years. but it doesn't exist everywhere. So in our state, a lot of good stuff is already in hand. And if you know how to tap it, find that information, that makes your job as a resources at risk specialist much easier. But you also have to know that not everything is identified in resources at risk. You have to reach out sometimes to the specific area and look for some other possible resources that aren't captured in the GRS, the GRPs. So, staffing up, it's so much of it really depends on the situation and what are going to be the challenges that you're going to be facing for a given scenario or a given actual event.
So when I get the call, when Wismet gets the call, and I tell my watch stander, activate Polaris. And so you're going to get the watch stander who calls you on the phone and will say the words worst case to you. What's going to happen after that?
Well, the first thing that runs through my head, and I can only imagine a lot of people that are in this business think the same thing. What product is it? Is it flashing off? Wouldn't that be nice? Or is it not?
Right. Is it? Right. Is it Bakken crude with
exactly
tons of light-ins, and it's just going to evaporate over the next 6-8 hours? Thank goodness. Right. Flash point of like minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Right.
Yep.
Or is it Alaska North Slope crude?
That's right.
Which we get a lot of here in Washington.
Well, and that's it. So what product is it? Where is the spill? And very, immediately on top of that, you're going to be asking, where is it going? Where has it already gone? And where is it going? So how quickly are eyes on it, and how closely are we tracking this, and then getting ahead of it and looking at trajectories? So, getting your trajectory specialist in is, another one of those areas that's either the situation unit or it's the environmental unit that's going to trigger a modeling. Of course, with a major event, you're going to have usually an SSC, somebody from NOAA, the scientific support coordinator, called out to assist the FOSC, Coast Guard, on the marine side. So right away, you're going to probably be able to tap into the SSC and NOAA and start to get some modeling done. So you can get some trajectory modeling and some weathering modeling. Of course, all those applications, you've already had guests talking about GNOME and Adios, and those models are available to anybody. So one could run the model themselves, but it always helps to, again, if you're looking at staffing, start to split the workload and divide it up and identify the best individuals to handle certain tasks. And so, one of the first things I would do is look to the SSC and NOAA and say, can I get trajectory models? I want trajectories because they're going to help give me a view outward of where the potential ramifications are of a particular incident. But I'm really, really going to rely on observations. I want good overflight information on a regular basis. I've actually designed and run quite a few exercises myself. And having been on real spills, sometimes where oil goes doesn't follow the trajectory. And one of my little pet peeves with exercises is when the trajectories are taken as, well, this is it. It says right here, this is where the oil's going. Really. But did you see the overflight information? Yeah, but that doesn't matter. This tells me where the oil's going. I'm sorry, but you are barking down the wrong path now. You have real data in front of you of where the oil is. Go with that. And now we're going to try to recalibrate the trajectory to see why is it diverging and not matching up with what is actually seen. So that's a challenge, but getting eyes on is critical.
So do you grab that NOAA scientific support coordinator and just drag him into the EU, sit him in a chair right next to you?
Well, some of them I know quite well, and they can work wherever they want to, just as long as they're responsive and I can get, they can get the information to us quickly. And then they're very good, of actually running, going back and saying, well, if these are the overflight observations and we have a divergence between trajectories, internally they'll go back and query and reset the program to, maybe it's you're using a wind vector or an effect vector or a dispersion factor that isn't quite matching the conditions on scene. So you go back into the model, tweak things, see if you can get closer to what the observations are and give you a closer forecast for the next round.
So with the trajectory in hand, what's next? What's your next priority?
Well, after you get the trajectories and you've already gone through the resources at risks, those are the first things out the door. The next thing is really starting to get the moving your shoreline program into place, your SCAT program. You want to get that in place as quickly as possible to coordinate and get some initial information directed towards operations when they're going to be looking at anything they can do on the shoreline. And sometimes it's even things like pre-cleaning. So as quickly as you can, you want to get the shoreline component in there. You need to start thinking also about the sampling program, and particularly if the air monitoring is going to be a big one in terms of safety. So you want to get some air monitoring out there. You're going to need to do sampling in terms of water analysis, water, what's exposed and to what degree, how far is this product, is it making it into the, is it all a surface spill, or do you have dispersion into the into the water column, natural dispersion into the water column? And then, of course, as you pointed out, you're going to be looking at alternative response techniques. So you're going to be looking at is this something that we want to consider dispersants for, or in situ burning, and start that movement in place. Of course, usually you'll get those instructions coming from the Unified Command, if those are going to be considerations. I mean, in some places they're not a consideration; it's just off the table. So you don't necessarily need to spend your time there, but in depending on the oil and the situation and where it's located, some of these could be very viable response techniques to accompany the standard techniques of mechanical containment and recovery. So those things would need to start happening very quickly as well. And then, of course, you've got your messaging for environmental messages for both operations as well as for public information. And you probably are at some point going to have to start thinking about particularly when we're dealing with shoreline and response operations and some of these alternative countermeasures, endangered species. So you have to collaborate with NIMS and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on endangered species and what restrictions might be out there for operations and overflights and even response on the shoreline, and your federal and state historic preservation officers, for the Section 7 consultations or 106 consultations. So those are things that all need to be done and considered pretty early in the response. The good news is if the FOSC and the state are mobilizing their team, the EU is quickly building up with not just people representing the responsible party, but you're getting a lot of staff from agency side as well, either remotely or in person. And you can obviously place a lot of reliance and know that you're going to get help from particularly the agency people on a lot of the consultation issues.
Let's assume that the Unified Command establishes an objective of considering aerial dispersants as an alternative strategy, and we are gearing up towards a Unified Command decision meeting, moving towards the RRT meeting. What does that take for you in the environmental unit to put that material together and get ready to make that pitch?
Well, again, one of the things that really helps us in this task is that the Northwest Area Plan has a very clear guidance on looking at dispersants and dispersant options, and then the steps that are recommended to go through in order to do an initial quick assessment of whether it's viable, dispersant application is viable, and then to actually pull together a transmittal for the RRT to consider it, given that initial assessment, and then an actual overall guidance for a dispersants operational plan, how that would happen. And I think, again, we really benefit from having a lot of this in place already laid out. If you go into the Northwest Area Plan, I forget what the annex is. It's 9406 dispersants decision for the Northwest Area Plan. But the basic things are, one, we have in Washington State zones in marine waters where dispersants are either nope, don't think about it. B, it's possible. You can go through the checklist and see if that's going to happen. Or three, yeah, this is a very likely area to go ahead and apply it. So sort of a pre-approved zone, a conditional zone, and then a no-go zone. So that's one of the first things you have to do is find out where, and this is where trajectories are important. Here's the spill, here's where it's going. So if today the FOSC says, Elliott, I need to get this process going. If, it's what, 3-4 o'clock in the afternoon, I can tell you dispersants are not going to happen tonight, okay? By the time we get this pulled together, goes through RRT, we get stuff mobilized, very unlikely that we're going to be able to fly because we're only going to apply dispersants in daylight. And I'm going to be running out of time here by the end of the day.
Although we're really lucky now because the MSRC C-130 is sitting in Moses Lake.
Well, that's true. That exactly. So
it used to be sitting in Stennis, Mississippi, and it's like 8 hours away. Now it's like parked in the parking lot. No,
that's huge. I mean, we can get it. It'll be here. Well, as a matter of fact, you can mobilize it so that as soon as you get the nod, it's already loaded up in here. So we could. It is possible that something like that could happen, right away. Even in because we still have daylight till what, 9 o'clock at night or something like that. But I want to know what my trajectories are, because I need to know where the stuff is going, because we're going to be assuming that the spill source is already controlled. If it's a continuous release, then we have new product showing up every day, every hour, adjacent to the vessel. It hasn't undergone any weathering, and we also know that, you know, if the spill source is still leaking, then, and it's within a zone, a conditional use zone, then we can start, you know, we could even consider applying it there. Although typically you want to put mechanical containment recovery at the source, because that's going to give you the greatest success. And you're going to be looking at dispersants where it's more spread out and where mechanical is less efficient. So you're going to go typically downfield from your source to consider dispersant applications. And that's where the trajectory comes in. Where is this moving? Is it moving into a no-go zone? If it's moving into the no-go zone, okay, can I get there before it gets into that area? So these are all, you know, considerations. The other one is what type of oil, how is it weathering, how long is it going to be dispersible? Once the viscosities get up to, you know, 10,000, 20,000 centistokes, then you can put dispersants on it, but and you might be able to disperse some, but you're going to have put way more dispersant on it than your typical, you know, 1-to-20 ratio that you might want it to try to do with, you know, when the viscosities hasn't really increased through the weathering process, or emulsion. If it's emulsified, you're not going to be able to get that. So these are some of the things that you're going through in that initial checklist that the FOC wants right away. Where's it going? How quickly? How's that oil behaving? How's it weathering? Is it dispersible? What dispersants do I have? Are they approved? No. Of course, any dispersants that are stockpiled are on the, you know, approved list, so that shouldn't be an issue. And then, are we going to be monitoring? Are we prepared to monitor for efficiency and effectiveness? So, do we have our SMART protocols? You know, the protocols for actually monitoring the application and the efficiency of the application. We have to go through the consultation process for wildlife considerations. So again, this is, you know, we'll be reaching out to Fish and Wildlife Service, to NIMS, and are there restrictions, or are there other considerations we need to deal with? And of course, with in this case, the Lumi tribe, you know, are we talking about fishing grounds or other sensitivities that we need to be aware of that dispersants and dispersed oil could possibly affect? So those are sort of the quick things that we're putting together is just in this initial checklist for FOC. If it's all looking good, then that goes up to Unified Command and saying, well, things are looking positive here. Maybe this is time to have that conversation with the RRT. And that's the next step. And that'll be Unified Command talking with the regional response team. And that can go back and forth. You know, they may ask or suggest other conditions, certain constraints on application. They may be asking for more monitoring, more sampling, who knows? But that discussion goes on. And then if it looks positive, then comes back, then we formalize with operations, what that dispersant plan is going to look like operationally and from a monitoring perspective.
I sat next to the dispersant group in Holma during Deepwater Horizon during the heyday of spray, when they were flying like crazy. And I think they were managing to pull off like 20 sorties a day at that point. And funny story, has nothing to do with the dispersant application process, but we were flying civilian aircraft and military aircraft. The Air Force was flying C-130s, and the civilian C-130s were landing. They were taxiing off the runway. They were chalking the wheels, shutting down, doing a safety brief, PPE check, loading dispersants. Time on the tarmac, turnaround was a little over an hour for the aircraft. The Air Force was landing on the runway, leaning on the brakes while the rotors spun. These guys wearing their BDUs and t-shirts with sunglasses and just some nitrile gloves would slam that hose on and fill it up like they were doing battle fueling, right?
Oh yeah.
And they were doing like 12-minute turnarounds on the tarmac.
Jeez. I know it's so true, how different organizations work, and some of them have all those protocols in place so that they don't shut down. Exactly. They know okay, this is how we're going to run this.
Yeah, well, I don't think of it as a bad thing. I just think that's pretty cool, because I was in the Coast Guard, and I know how it is to try to be the quickest, and they OSHA doesn't apply to them, so they were doing their thing.
Oh yeah, exactly. Wow. Now it's remarkable how once you get the process in place, as with so many things, once you have the kind of the basic process in place, every day you're on it, you're just improving and finding out how you can be more effective and more efficient, and how you can get things done quicker. And I on so many actual spills, this is one of those things you see over and over again. Just the quickness and efficiency just ramps up so quickly, because the conditions are changing. You're trying to get so many things in place in a very quick way. Yeah.
Yeah, you're just iterating all the time. John Murphy at Gen West said, I think he was quoting somebody else, but we reserve the right to be smarter later, right? I'm going to be better. I think I don't remember who he was quoting, but yeah, well, I may not know, I may not be as good at it today as I'm going to be tomorrow.
Right. Yeah.
So putting SMART in place, like MSRC doesn't do the SMART monitoring. They provide, they'll be the quickest here to provide the dispersant application capability for us. We have NRC has some aerial dispersant capability. Clean Gulf has aerial dispersant capability. OSRL internationally has dispersant capability. But who's going to get out and do this SMART monitoring? The Coast Guard Strike Team has some capability to do some of that work. What's been your experience there?
Yeah, well, we've, it's, you do have the strike team, of course. NOAA is typically well set up to have some of their folks working again in concert with the SSC to support the SMART monitoring, and then there's private resources, of course, that you can reach out to as well, and to do some of the SMART protocols as well. So it would be a combination of looking immediately at what resources are available. The strike team, NOAA, and I mean ourselves, we have a fluorometer, for instance, that we've been out and we've run alongside others to draw samples and look at potential effectiveness of dispersion into the water column. So in setting up the operational plan for dispersants application, that would be one of the things to identify is, and again, that's, we consult with the state, we consult with the federal side and the SSC, and we'll come up with who and where we would put these resources out to do the monitoring during and following dispersant application.
Here in Washington, I think around the country in general, but Washington, Oregon, California in particular, there's going to be public outcry at the use of dispersants. And our messaging is going to be really important. You mentioned environmental messaging coming out of the EU. What kind of support do you provide to the public information officer for getting out messaging surrounding the use of dispersants?
Well, yeah, that's going to be very important. And again, this is where it's critical within the EU that we're working as a team, that we can put together that messaging. The things that usually you're going to be looking at, particularly with applying dispersants or any other alternative countermeasures, is what's the trade-off? What is the benefit gained by doing this, and what would happen if we didn't do this? And that's really the better one is able to present that argument and present that information, the more successful it is. It doesn't mean that people are always going to buy into it, but at least you're putting and explaining the rationale of why you're opting to use these other countermeasures to minimize the potential effects of the response itself and of the spill. And so it's really explaining net environmental benefit or spill impact mitigation assessment. You know, the two terms that are used are NEBA and SEMA. So what is, when you use dispersants, what are you gaining? What are the drawbacks? Why are we using it? Typically, we're not going to use it as the only countermeasure. We're using it to complement the work that is being done using standard mechanical systems, and we're focusing the use of, in this particular case, dispersants on one portion of the spill to minimize what is going to potentially be a shoreline impact more than anything else. Oil, that once oil hits the shoreline, usually the impact and the effects of oil are going to be much more significant than they are on the water column. And what organisms and species are utilize the water surface, diving birds and ducks and anything that uses the surface and the immediate water column below that surface. Usually we're talking about the top 30 feet of the water column. That's, once you apply that dispersant, that's where most of that dispersed oil is going to reside until it, like a cloud, until it becomes very diffuse and starts to break down. So one is to explain that the trade-off is that we're really minimizing that the impact of that oil on all the coastal shoreline and the shallow water resources. And we're going to live with a shorter term effect that's limited to the top part of the water column.
Yeah, in this area, there's a lot of Dungeness crab tribes have shellfish beds that we need to keep the oil out of if at all possible. I mean, that would be by itself a good use of dispersants if we could keep oil out of that coastal zone, out of the shellfish beds.
Absolutely. Yeah. You want to keep it out of those. And again, those aren't necessarily right at the shoreline, but they're subtidal, but they're shallow subtidal up to a certain point. Certainly the shellfish that are being harvested are typically going to be in the shallower subtidal. And in the state, the restriction is 60 feet. I got to convert meters, but yeah, 20 meters, 60 feet in the state of Washington. So that if you're using dispersants and you're getting dispersion again into the water column, that you're not going to be really exposing the organisms that are utilizing the seabed to any high concentrations. When you're down at 60 feet, you're beyond that zone where that dispersed cloud is going to be initially, and then again that tends to gradually become more and more dilute with currents, and you're limiting what's being exposed to that dispersed oil.
Well, I guess we're lucky in Washington to the extent that it's pretty deep in most of our coastal area. I mean, the average depth in Puget Sound is over 300 feet. Off Turn Point on Stewart Island, it's 1,400 feet deep. So
yeah,
we've got a lot of depth to work with, and we have a lot of water movement, and it's not stagnant. That water moves. Coming out of Guimas Channel, it runs over 5 knots. Coming down Rosario, 3-4 knots is common. So we get a lot of water movement, which helps with this process too.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, the combination of deeper waters and that fast movement are just are going to be important in terms of very quickly diluting the dispersed droplets themselves, and the fact that there's no contact with so much of the seabed, and the zones in which dispersants would be approved, should Unified Command go ahead with it, are going to be restricted to deeper waters. So they're going to be restricted to 60 feet and beyond and deeper, so that you don't run the risk of having any dispersant or dispersed oil exposure with the subtidal benthic organisms.
So we're trying to get this process ramped up as quickly as possible. The oil is starting to weather. There's a window of effectiveness that we need to operate within. If the Unified Command and FOSC ask for the EU to work through this process, how long can we reasonably expect it to take? And what kind of staff do you need in the EU to get through this process?
The ideal staff is going to be a dispersant technical specialist, somebody who understands dispersants and the limitations and what you're going to be using. You want to have your resources at risk specialists, so that you know what areas are off limits because of particular sensitivities or not. You need to have a consultation process ready to roll in terms of consulting with endangered species, or even historical properties, or if you're looking at tribal concerns and considerations, if it's areas that are adjacent or used for traditional use, all that consultation, you want to have it ready to do that initial consultation right away. So you will need to have your dispersant specialist prepared to work with these other parties, and with the state. But it doesn't need to be a big team. As a matter of fact, it's better to develop the initial checklist with a small team, and be able to reach out and do your consultation with your cohorts in the environmental unit. The SSC, of course, is going to be a big part of it as well. The SSC, because they are in direct contact with the FOSC, can shorten any concerns or questions that the FOSC may be thinking of or have before it sort of that preliminary check and recommendation from the environmental unit is forwarded up to the FOSC. So that's the group really right there. A small group. You should have the SSC state dispersant specialist working on that, and then do the consultation process, and then back up to the Unified Command. The time that it takes, it doesn't take very long for the initial consultation. You want to make sure you've got your trajectories. So you need to know where you're planning on applying this and what your window is. You need to know what the oil weathering is going to look like. So you can, again, the same SSC can be helping with the trajectories or you can run it and run audios so you can see what the viscosity curve looks like. And is this oil likely to emulsify or not within the period of time that you're planning on using this? But those things can be done fairly quickly. So, once you get the instruction from Unified Command that yes, we're going to launch this, you should be that small team can have a draft that checklist done within half an hour or less than an hour. But then it's the consultation, and sometimes that can just. Sometimes it's the people are there, they're very responsive. Other times it's painfully slow because you just can't get the right people for the consultation process. Even the FOSC taking it to for a discussion with the RRT can take some time, or it can be a very quick process also. These are all the variables that are out there. Exercises are one thing, real situation is usually another. Having done this sort of thing, doing a dispersant plan application here in Washington, very straightforward because we have a really good set of tools to go with. And that's pretty much the same for the West Coast. Other places around the world, maybe not so much. And having done exercises on the north of us here, just up on the Canadian side, we can go through the checklist. And if it's an exercise, you can actually get a pre-approval or an approval. But if you talk to most folks, either the RO, WCMRC, or talk to the Canadian Coast Guard or Ministry of Environment or Environment Canada and Environment Climate Change Canada, I probably don't want to waste your time going through the process if it's a real spill, because it's just the process is not streamlined to actually approve dispersants use, certainly not out here on the West Coast.
I participated in CanUS LANT some years ago where dispersants was part of the exercise. The Canadians wouldn't actually give an approval. Technically, adding those chemicals to the water is also a violation of law, and we'll apply them if you want to. We'll decide whether to prosecute you for it later. I mean, you are adding something else to the water, and I heard it described, I thought, really well by a guy from Exxon years ago. The situation's bad. We know that this is not going to make it good, but it can make it less bad. I like that part, less bad, right? And is the less bad that we're going to make it good enough, less bad enough to justify it?
That's right. It's the trade-off. It's the net environmental benefit of using or not using that countermeasure. That's exactly it. Yeah, and doing it in an exercise is one thing. Doing it for real could be a little bit different, and that's. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, the east coast of Canada actually has now they're in a better position to consider dispersant use on the east coast. And of course, it helps a lot that the Gulf Stream current sweeps up along the coast and carries it towards the middle of the Atlantic. So that's on the positive side. Over here on the West Coast, it's not quite as straightforward.
Well, and over there on the east coast of Canada, they have offshore drilling, or they have the potential for ongoing releases. You know, it's a different industry that's going on over there,
Exactly.
and they have a much stronger need to have a disbursement process because they're more likely to need it if something were to happen. Or they have the potential for something Deepwater Horizon like to happen, where we simply don't have that problem here on the West Coast.
That's exactly it. You know, dispersants is just one countermeasure. You know, you got the in situ burning. It has its checklists and its considerations in a similar format, and particularly here in the Northwest, it's got, you know, the annexes that help you go through that process. You have shoreline cleaners, you know, that are going to help deal with some of the more persistent oil if it makes it onto certain shorelines, and how to improve and remove it from those shorelines. But so there's all these things that are outside of your what we call traditional response countermeasures, and to the extent that at least here in Washington or in the Northwest, that, you know, they've been thought and built around, plans been created that actually takes these into consideration and provides for a means to decide on whether you're going to use it or not in a consultation process with with the federal representatives and state representatives and the responsible parties. So it's and honestly, working around the world, we have this advantage of having developed these tools to the extent that they are developed here in the Northwest as a wonderful point of export to the rest of the world. I mean, in so many of the plans that I've helped work with countries around the world, and I get asked to do a lot of the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, model courses for different countries around the world, taking these as examples of what can be done and how to streamline the process, and tools that are readily available. It's wonderful to be able to say, yes, these have been tried, tested, they've been used, and guess what? You don't have to start from scratch. You can take this and you're already ahead of the game.
Yep, I call that R&D, rip off and duplicate.
Exactly.
Why would you want to start from scratch?
No, that's right. You don't want to. Not in this game, not in this business. Yeah. No, that's exactly right. I mean, just try to get the best tools out there. So people have the benefit of, you know, what has been learned and gained elsewhere. Yeah.
Well, I'm looking forward to doing this drill with you. If somebody wanted to reach out and contact Polaris for assistance with response plans or SCAD or NERDA, you'll come back on the show and we'll talk about NERDA separately, right?
Well, I did already give Greg a heads up warning. And I said, Greg, you know, you may be asked to come on board and do a session with Dan on natural resource damage assessment. He's on board. So you don't have to listen to me again. You get to listen to Greg on this one.
Well, I wouldn't mind listening to you, but we'll definitely do that one. We'll reach out and schedule it to him. But if somebody wanted to reach out and for consultation help, do you want to provide an email address here at the end, or phone number, or both?
Sure. It's E. Taylor. So just my first initial, Elliott E. Taylor, Taylor, at Polaris Applied Sciences.com. And sciences is plural, sciences, but it's just one long string. And then the phone number, certainly feel free to call me at my cell phone's 206-660-5753, or our general office number is 425-823-4841.
Great. Dr. Elliott Taylor. Polaris Applied Sciences, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Hey, Dan, it's my pleasure. I look forward to working with you here on the exercise. Be careful with what you dream up, okay? And it's been a pleasure. And great work with the podcast. Keep it up. I think this is super.
Thank you for joining us in the tactics meeting. I learned a lot today, and I hope you did too. I spend most of my time in operations, so it's great to be able to talk to somebody like Dr. Taylor about the inner workings of the environmental unit. If you enjoyed the show, help us spread the word. Send a link to a friend, a colleague, send a tweet. If you would like to be on the show, you can email me. My email address is my name, dansmiley@mac.com.